Disinherited by my family for marrying a mechanic. Dad labeled me a disgrace and left all wealth to my brother. 19 years later, I returned as a successful mogul who rebuilt the town. When they went bankrupt and tried to hijack my opening, a witness told the truth. Hey everyone, welcome back to Vance Rock Stories. Today's story is about family expectations, difficult choices, and what happens when someone spends years proving everyone wrong. If you've ever been judged for choosing your own path, leave a comment below. And if you enjoy stories about resilience and hard-earned success, don't forget to subscribe. My name is Tessa Holloway, and I grew up in Willow Creek, Kentucky. In a town like Willow Creek, your last name could open doors before you even knocked on them. And Holloway was one of those names. My father, Victor Holloway, had spent years building a reputation as one of the town's most successful businessmen. People respected him. They listened when he spoke. Some even treated his opinions like facts. Growing up, I thought my future was already mapped out. Dad had a plan for everything. My older brother, Colton, would eventually take over the family businesses. I was expected to study business, help expand the family investments, and represent the Holloway name in all the right circles. For a long time, I tried to fit that picture. I took the classes Dad wanted. I attended networking events. I listened to conversations about business deals and expansion plans. The problem was that none of it felt like my dream. It felt like an assignment. Around that same time, I met Luke Carter. Luke worked as a mechanic at a repair shop on the edge of town. We met after my car broke down one afternoon. What started as a simple conversation somehow turned into an hour of talking about life, books, and future plans. Being around him felt easy. There were no expectations, no performance, no pressure to become someone else. At first, our relationship stayed quiet. Then months passed. Then years. The longer we dated, the more I understood why I hadn't told my father. I already knew what he'd think. To Dad, success came with a specific image. A mechanic didn't fit into that image. The funny thing was, Luke never tried to pull me away from my family. Whenever I talked about the pressure at home, he'd shrug and say, "You should do what makes you happy." Simple advice, but nobody in my family ever asked what would make me happy. By the time I turned 18, keeping my relationship secret became harder. Dad started noticing changes. He asked where I spent my weekends, why I skipped certain events, why I seemed distracted whenever college plans came up. I avoided the questions as long as I could. Then one evening, everything started unraveling. We were having dinner together. Mom sat beside Dad. Colton sat across from me. The conversation started normally. Then Dad looked at me. "Have you decided on Western Kentucky's business program yet?" "A little," I said. Dad frowned. "A little isn't an answer." The room suddenly felt smaller. "I've been considering other options." Dad slowly put down his fork. "What options?" I hesitated. That was a mistake. Victor Holloway hated hesitation. To him, hesitation meant resistance. "You've been acting differently lately," he said. "I'm just trying to figure things out." At 18, it's time to stop figuring things out. Nobody spoke after that. Not Mom, not Colton, especially not me. Then I said something that had been building inside me for months. "Maybe my future doesn't look exactly the way you planned." The silence was immediate. Dad stared at me. Finally, he asked, "Is there someone influencing these decisions?" My stomach tightened. Across the table, I noticed Colton watching the conversation with unusual interest, almost like he had been expecting this moment. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Dad already knew. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. His voice stayed calm, but somehow that made it worse. "Tessa, whatever this is, I suggest you end it." I felt my pulse quicken. Dad held my gaze. Because if you continue down the wrong path, you'll force me to make decisions neither of us will enjoy." The room went completely silent, and for the first time it sounded less like advice from a father and more like a warning. Dad didn't raise his voice after that dinner. Honestly, that was the scary part. Victor Holloway was used to getting his way. When he couldn't, he didn't explode. He got quieter, more deliberate. For the next few weeks, every conversation felt like a negotiation I never agreed to join. One morning he stopped me before I left the house. "I spoke with the admissions office. I already knew where this was going. Dad, they're holding a place for you." I sighed. "I haven't decided anything yet." His jaw tightened. "You had a plan. A good one." "No. You had a plan." The look he gave me lasted only a second, but it told me we'd crossed into dangerous territory. Outside our house, things weren't much easier. Willow Creek wasn't a big town. People talked. By then, everyone seemed to know I was dating Luke. Or at least, they thought they knew. The rumors kept changing. Some people said I was throwing away college. Others said I was running off with him. One woman actually asked if I was pregnant. I laughed when she said it. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe a stranger felt comfortable asking. Even some friends started acting differently. Conversations became awkward. Invitations stopped coming. People who used to know me suddenly treated me like a cautionary tale. Luke noticed it before I did. One evening we were sitting by the river after he finished work. "You look tired," he said. "I am? Because of me?" I looked at him. "What?" "Tessa, if this is costing you everything." "Stop." He fell quiet. "I'm not losing things because of you," I said. "I'm losing them because other people don't like my choices." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. A small one. That smile always made things feel a little less heavy. As the wedding plans became more serious, Dad changed tactics. Instead of arguing with me, he started making obstacles appear. A venue suddenly became unavailable. A family friend withdrew from helping. People who had promised support quietly disappeared. Nobody said Dad was involved. Nobody had to. One evening, I found Mom sitting alone in the living room. She was looking through old family photos. For a minute, we just sat there. Then she quietly said, "Your father thinks he's doing what's best." I let out a short laugh. "Does he ever ask what's best for me?" Mom stared at the album. For a second, I thought she might finally take my side. Instead, she sighed. "You know how he is." That became her answer to everything. Not agreement, not disagreement, just acceptance. And somehow that hurt more. A few days later, I overheard Dad and Colton talking in his office. The door wasn't fully closed. "She's making a mistake," Colton said. Dad stayed silent. "You gave her every opportunity." I stood there long enough to hear that. Long enough to understand something. My brother wasn't trying to help me. He was making sure Dad saw him as the loyal one, the dependable one, the son who never challenged anything. As the wedding got closer, the guest list got smaller. Relatives found excuses. Old family friends stopped calling. Every cancellation felt like another reminder that people were choosing sides. Luke never complained. He just kept showing up, helping, listening, being there. One night we were reviewing final wedding details at his apartment. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You still sure?" I looked at him, then at the shrinking guest list, then back at him. "Yes." For the first time in months, the answer came easily. I was sure about him. The wedding was less than 24 hours away when my phone buzzed. Most of my belongings were already packed. I glanced at the screen. Dad. Just one message. One sentence. No greeting. No explanation. "If you go through with this wedding tomorrow, do not come back to this house." I stared at my father's message for a long time, not because I didn't understand it, because I did. Every word, every implication. Luke noticed something was wrong almost immediately. What happened? I handed him my phone. He read the message once, then again. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he set the phone down. I'm sorry. That was it. No angry speech, no criticism, just two simple words. And somehow that made it harder. The next morning, I woke up knowing I had a choice. I could keep trying to earn my family's approval, or I could get married. Turns out those weren't compatible anymore. The wedding itself was small, much smaller than what people expected from a Holloway daughter. A few friends came. Some co-workers from Luke's shop showed up. A couple of neighbors. That was about it. I kept glancing toward the entrance anyway. Part of me hoped Mom might walk in, or maybe Colton, even Dad. Nobody came. When the ceremony started, there were several empty seats on my side. I tried not to look at them. Luke squeezed my hand. You okay? I nodded. Not because it was true, because there wasn't much else to say. A little while later, I became Tessa Carter. For a few minutes, I felt genuinely happy, not relieved, not defiant, just happy. The kind of happiness that comes from making a choice for yourself. The reception was held in a small community hall. Nothing fancy. People laughed. A few people danced. Someone brought homemade pie. At one point, Luke's coworkers started telling embarrassing stories about him. For the first time in weeks, I forgot about the conflict. I forgot about the rumors. I forgot about my father. Then reality started catching up. One relative after another sent messages. Most weren't congratulations. Some were polite. Others weren't. One aunt wrote that she hoped I knew what I was giving up. A cousin simply texted, I guess you've made your choice. By evening, it became obvious. The Holloway family wasn't just unhappy. They were done with me. A few days later, that became official. Mom called. I answered on the first ring. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly said, Your father updated his estate documents. I already knew where this was going. He removed your name. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because I wanted the money, because it felt final, like someone had erased me with a signature. Mom sounded exhausted. I thought you should know. Did you agree with it? The silence on the other end lasted too long. I have to go, Tessa. Then the call ended. That was the last real conversation we had for years. Married life started quickly. There wasn't much time to sit around feeling sorry for ourselves. Bills arrived. Rent was due. Cars needed repairs. Normal life. At first, I kept telling myself we'd be fine. Luke worked full-time. I had some savings. We were careful. Responsible. Or at least, I thought we were. One evening, we sat down at the kitchen table with receipts, account balances, and monthly expenses spread in front of us. The numbers didn't look right. I checked them twice. Then a third time. Luke rubbed the back of his neck. That's less than I expected. Me too. A lot less. Some of the money I'd assumed would be available wasn't. A few expenses had piled up faster than expected. The wedding, moving costs, deposits. Small things added up. For the first time, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Not because we were broke. Not yet. But because I suddenly understood how fragile everything was. A single mistake could put us in real trouble. Still, we pushed forward. We found a small rental house and submitted the paperwork. Nothing special, just a modest place we could afford. A few days later, the landlord called. I expected good news. Instead, his voice sounded uncomfortable. There's been a change. What kind of change? The property won't be available. I frowned. But we already signed? I know. He sounded genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry. The call ended a few minutes later. I sat there staring at my phone. Luke looked up from across the room. What happened? I swallowed. The rental fell through. His expression changed immediately. Okay. It wasn't okay. That house had been our plan, our backup plan, and our only plan. For the first time since the wedding, neither of us had an answer. We just looked at each other, and I honestly didn't know where we were supposed to go next. We can stay in the car for a few days if we have to. Luke said it with a straight face. I laughed, not because it was funny, because the alternative was crying. We spent the next several days calling landlords, checking listings, and chasing every lead we could find. Every option seemed to disappear the moment we got close. Some places were too expensive. Others were already rented. A few never even called back. Our savings were shrinking faster than either of us expected. One evening, I was staring at a notebook filled with numbers when Luke sat beside me. You've checked that page 6 times. 7. He smiled. Any different on the 7th? Unfortunately not. For a second, we both laughed. Then we looked back at the numbers. Reality wasn't nearly as funny. A week later, I walked into a small diner downtown looking for work. It wasn't glamorous. Actually, it was exactly the kind of job my father would have hated, which probably made me want it even more. The manager looked over my application. You ever worked in food service before? No. You willing to learn? Absolutely. He nodded. When can you start? That simple question felt like a victory. I started the following Monday. The work was harder than I expected. Long hours, sore feet, customers who were wonderful, customers who definitely weren't. Some days I came home exhausted. Other days I came home exhausted and covered in coffee. Luke would usually grin and ask, "Rough day?" I would point at my uniform. Take a guess. Despite everything, those moments mattered. We didn't have much money, but we still had each other. One afternoon, near the end of a lunch shift, I noticed a familiar face sitting near the window. At first I couldn't place her. Then she smiled. And suddenly, I remembered. Mrs. Henderson? She laughed. Well, it's Ruth now. Ruth Henderson had been one of my teachers in high school. Back then, she was one of the few adults who encouraged me to think for myself. We talked for a few minutes before she left. The next day, she came back. Then a few days later, she came back again. Eventually, she stopped pretending the coffee was the reason. You look tired, she said one afternoon. I laughed. Apparently everyone can tell. You've been carrying the weight of the world since you were 17. That's an exaggeration. It isn't. That was Ruth. Direct, without being cruel. A few weeks later, she invited Luke and me to dinner. I almost said no, not because I didn't want to go, because I hated feeling like a charity case. Ruth seemed to read my mind immediately. This isn't pity. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. Luke kicked me lightly under the table. I accepted the invitation. Dinner turned into several dinners. Those dinners turned into long conversations. For the first time since leaving home, I spent time with someone who knew my family history, but wasn't judging me for it. Ruth never asked why I disappointed my father. She asked how I was doing. That difference mattered. More than I realized. One evening, she told me something I had completely forgotten. You know, I always expected you'd do something big. I nearly choked on my drink. Have you seen my life lately? I'm serious. I shook my head. I wait tables. Today. She pointed a finger at me. That's what you do today. Not forever. Nobody had talked to me that way in a long time. Most people treated my future like a closed book. Ruth acted like I was still writing it. As the months passed, life remained difficult. The diner paid the bills. Barely. Luke worked as many hours as he could. We learned how to stretch every dollar. We stopped buying things we didn't absolutely need. Every small expense became a discussion. Every unexpected bill became a problem to solve. It wasn't the life I'd imagined growing up, but it was real. And strangely enough, I was beginning to feel stronger. One evening, after dinner at Ruth's house, we stayed behind while she cleared a few dishes. The conversation drifted from work to family, then from family to the future. Ruth sat down across from me. For a moment, she simply watched me. Not in an uncomfortable way, more like she was waiting for something. Finally, she asked a question nobody had ever asked before. Not my father, not my mother, not anyone. What do you actually want for yourself? I opened my mouth to answer, and realized I had no idea. What do you actually want for yourself? I wish I could tell you I had an inspiring answer ready. I didn't. I just sat there staring at Ruth. For most of my life, somebody else had been deciding what my future should look like. First my father, then circumstances, then bills. Nobody had ever stopped and asked what I wanted, including me. Ruth didn't push. She simply nodded and changed the subject. But the question stayed with me for weeks, maybe months. Life kept moving. The diner remained busy. Luke kept working long hours at the repair shop. And slowly, little by little, we stopped feeling like we were barely surviving. Not because things became easy, because we became better at handling them. Then Sophie arrived. The moment I held my daughter for the first time, everything shifted. Suddenly, every decision felt bigger. Every dollar mattered more. Every risk carried extra weight. I remember bringing her home and staring at her tiny face while she slept. Luke sat beside me. She's perfect. I smiled. Let's hope she got your patience. He laughed. Then we're in trouble. Those early months were exhausting. Neither of us slept much. Some days I felt like my entire life revolved around bottles, diapers, and trying to stay awake. But they were also some of the happiest days I'd ever known. For the first time, I wasn't focused on what I'd lost. I was focused on what we were building. Ruth became a regular part of our lives. She loved Sophie immediately. Sometimes she'd stop by with groceries. Other times she'd simply show up and hold the baby while I caught my breath. At first, accepting help felt uncomfortable. I spent years trying to prove I didn't need anyone. Ruth eventually called me out on it. You know, letting people care about you isn't weakness. I know. No, you don't. I laughed because she was right. Over time, I stopped arguing. One evening, while Sophie slept nearby, Ruth asked if I'd ever considered going back to school. I nearly choked on my coffee. With what time? You'd find time. I have a baby, a job, and bills. You also have a brain. That was Ruth's style, blunt, direct, annoyingly accurate. A few weeks later, I enrolled in evening classes. Nothing dramatic, just one class at a time. The first night felt strange. I was older than some students, more tired than all of them. But sitting in that classroom reminded me that my life wasn't finished. I still had options. One unexpected thing happened at the diner around that time. A regular customer named Mr. Barnes came in almost every Thursday. Retired banker. Always ordered the same meal. One afternoon, he overheard me helping a new waitress understand some paperwork. When I finished, he looked at me and said, "You ever thought about real estate?" I laughed. Not once. I'm serious. He pointed toward the empty storefront across the street. Somebody's going to buy that place eventually. I shrugged. Okay. Most people only see a rundown building. He smiled. Opportunity usually looks rundown at first. The comment stuck with me. After that, I started noticing buildings, vacant stores, old properties, for sale signs, places other people ignored. I found myself asking questions. Who owned them? What were they worth? Why were they sitting empty? The curiosity surprised me. Even more surprising, I actually enjoyed learning about it. A few months later, I mentioned real estate during dinner at Ruth's house. Her eyes immediately lit up. There it is. There what is? Something you're genuinely interested in. Luke looked between us. I've never seen her talk this much about anything involving numbers. That's not true. It absolutely is. I rolled my eyes, but they both laughed because they knew it was true. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing someone else's dream. I was discovering my own. That excitement lasted until I started researching what it would take to become licensed. The classes, the fees, the exam costs, the study materials. I added everything together and stared at the total. Then I looked at our bank account. Then back at the total. That night, Luke found me sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator. He glanced at the paperwork. You've got that look. What look? The one where you're about to suggest something expensive. I slid the information across the table. He read it quietly. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Finally, he set the papers down. The opportunity was real. For the first time, so was the possibility of building a better future. The problem was that one mistake could wipe out most of the money we'd managed to save. And neither of us knew whether we could afford to take that chance. Luke looked at the licensing paperwork, then at me. You really want this, don't you? I nodded. I do. He didn't give me a speech about money or risks. He simply said, then we'll make it work. That was one of the best things about our marriage. We didn't always know how to solve a problem, but we never faced one alone. The months that followed were exhausting. I worked shifts at the diner, took classes at night, and studied whenever Sophie was asleep. Sometimes I fell asleep with textbooks open beside me. There were plenty of moments when I questioned whether I was being irresponsible. Every fee felt expensive. Every exam felt important. But for the first time, I wasn't chasing somebody else's dream. I was chasing mine. The day I passed the licensing exam, I sat in my car staring at the results screen. Then I called Luke. Well? He answered immediately. I smiled. I passed. His cheer was so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. That night we celebrated with takeout and grocery store dessert. Nothing fancy, but it felt like a victory. Getting licensed turned out to be the easy part. Finding clients was much harder. For months, almost nobody called. I spent hours networking, introducing myself, and trying to build credibility. Most conversations ended politely and went nowhere. At first, I blamed my lack of experience. Then I started noticing a pattern. One potential client canceled after hearing my full name. Another became distant as soon as he realized who my father was. Eventually, a woman explained it without meaning to. Oh, she said, you're Victor Holloway's daughter. The tone said everything. Suddenly I understood. The Holloway name wasn't opening doors. It was closing them. Dad had spent years telling people his version of my story. The irresponsible daughter. The disappointment. The girl who threw away her future. Some people believed him, others weren't sure. Either way, it affected me. One afternoon, I met a potential client at a coffee shop. The conversation was going well until he asked, "Does your father still influence your decisions?" "No," I said. Something changed in his expression. The meeting ended shortly afterward. He never called back. Driving home, I felt defeated. Not because I'd lost one client, because I realized I was still paying for choices I'd made years earlier. That evening, I vented to Ruth. She listened patiently before saying something unexpected. "Good." I stared at her. "Good? Now you know who's interested in you and who's interested in your family." I wanted to argue. Instead, I sat there thinking about it. She was right. The people walking away weren't my people. The ones staying were. That realization changed something. I stopped explaining my family history, stopped defending my choices. And little by little, I stopped waiting for my family to call. For years, I'd imagined Dad reaching out, apologizing, asking about Sophie, anything. Eventually, I accepted that it probably wasn't going to happen. Oddly enough, that acceptance felt peaceful. My first real success came from a retired couple selling a small property. It wasn't a huge listing. Nobody in town cared about it. But I cared. I worked harder on that deal than anyone should. When it finally closed, I sat in my car and cried. Not because of the commission, because it proved I could actually do this. More clients followed. Slowly, one at a time. The progress wasn't dramatic, but it was real. For the first time, confidence started replacing fear. One afternoon, I was organizing paperwork in my tiny office when my phone rang. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't familiar. Instead, I answered. The caller introduced himself as the owner of several commercial properties around Willow Creek. I recognized the name immediately. Almost everyone in town would have. He got straight to the point. "I've been hearing good things about your work." We talked for nearly 20 minutes. When the call ended, I looked at the list of properties he wanted to discuss. There were more buildings on that list than I'd handled in my entire career, and if the meeting went well, everything I'd been working toward might finally start moving a lot faster. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. By the time it ended, I was mentally exhausted. The property owner asked tough questions about market conditions, investment risks, commercial development, future growth. The kind of questions that would have terrified me a few years earlier. Now I found myself answering them. Not perfectly, but confidently. When I got back to my office, I sat in my chair and stared at the wall. Luke called a few minutes later. "How'd it go?" "I think I survived." "That's not an answer." I laughed. "I think it went well." A week later, I got confirmation. The client wanted to work with me. That single opportunity led to another, then another. Suddenly, I wasn't spending all my time searching for clients. I was trying to keep up with them. For the first time, my calendar started filling faster than I could manage alone. One evening, I was reviewing contracts at the kitchen table when Luke looked over my shoulder. "You know you're working too much, right?" I thought this was what success looked like. "It is." He pointed at the paperwork. "But successful people also sleep." I promised I'd take a break. I was lying. He knew I was lying. We both laughed. Business kept growing. Not overnight. Not in some dramatic movie-style transformation. Just steadily. Month after month. Deal after deal. The biggest change came when I stopped focusing only on selling properties. I became interested in improving them. Willow Creek had dozens of empty buildings sitting unused, old storefronts, vacant offices, properties people drove past without noticing. Most investors ignored them. I couldn't stop looking at them. Every time I passed one, I found myself imagining what it could become. A bakery, a bookstore, a cafe, a small business. Something useful. Something alive again. Eventually, I took a chance and bought one. A tiny property that needed far more work than I could afford. Luke walked through the building with me and shook his head. "You realize this place looks terrible. Thank you for your support. It smells weird." "Very supportive." He laughed, then helped me renovate it anyway. That first project wasn't spectacular, but it worked. A local business moved in. The building came back to life. People noticed. Then I bought another property. And another. Years passed. Sophie's school pictures started replacing old bills on our refrigerator. Our house became a little bigger. Our savings became a little stronger. Life became a little less fragile. One afternoon, Sophie asked me a question while we were walking downtown. "Mom, Did you fix that building too? She pointed toward a renovated storefront. I nodded. And that one? Yes. And that one? Also yes. She looked genuinely impressed. For some reason, that meant more than any business award ever could. As more projects succeeded, people started treating me differently. Not as Victor Holloway's daughter. Not as the girl who married a mechanic. Just Tessa. Business owner. Developer. Community partner. The shift was gradual, but it was real. Even people who had once believed the rumors began changing their opinions. A restaurant owner thanked me for helping revive a neglected block. A local teacher told me the new businesses were creating jobs for former students. Small comments. But they mattered. For the first time, I felt like I belonged in Willow Creek on my own terms. A few years later, I officially launched Holloway Property Group. The name surprised some people. A few friends even asked why I kept it. The answer was simple. I wasn't giving the name back. I had earned it too. The company continued growing, and something interesting happened. The more successful I became, the less often people mentioned my father. Victor's reputation still existed, but it no longer controlled every conversation. People were forming their own opinions now, their opinions of me. One Friday afternoon, I was sitting in my office reviewing plans for another redevelopment project. Outside, downtown Willow Creek looked busier than it had in years. Families were walking the sidewalks. Businesses were open. Storefronts that had once sat empty now had lights on. For a moment, I allowed myself to enjoy it. Life felt stable, not perfect, but stable. The kind of stability I'd spent nearly 2 decades building. Then my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but I recognized it immediately. I hadn't seen it appear on my phone in almost 19 years. My brother's number. Colton Holloway. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. Part of me wanted to ignore it. The other part wanted to know why my brother had suddenly remembered I existed. Tessa? His voice sounded older. Of course it did. 19 years had passed. Still, hearing it felt strange. Colton. A short silence followed. Then he laughed awkwardly. Well, this is weird. I almost said, "You think?" Instead, I waited. He started talking about ordinary things. The weather, Willow Creek, business. As if we'd spoken last week instead of almost 2 decades ago. It was one of the strangest conversations of my life. At one point, he asked about Sophie, then about Luke, then about my company. None of the questions were inappropriate. They just felt misplaced, like he was trying to skip 19 years of history. Eventually, I asked the obvious question. Why are you calling? Another pause. Can't a brother call his sister? I leaned back in my chair. No. That made him laugh again, but this time it sounded forced. We ended the call a few minutes later without him actually explaining anything. The whole conversation left a bad feeling in my stomach. That evening, Luke noticed immediately. You've got your thinking face. I have a thinking face? You absolutely have a thinking face. I told him about the call. His response was immediate. What does he want? Exactly. Neither of us believed Colton had called out of guilt, or nostalgia, or sibling affection. Not after 19 years. A week passed, then he called again. This time he skipped the small talk faster. Not completely. Just enough to make it obvious he was working towards something. He asked about several development projects around town, then about commercial property values, then about local investment trends. By the end of the conversation, I wasn't listening to his words anymore. I was listening to what he wasn't saying. When I finally asked what was going on, he changed the subject. Again. That happened 3 separate times. By the 3rd call, my patience was disappearing. Colton. What? You're fishing. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. He sighed. For a moment, I thought he might finally be honest. Instead, he started asking about Sophie. Again. The conversation ended shortly afterward. The next clue came from someone else entirely. A local banker I knew casually mentioned hearing rumors about one of the Holloway businesses struggling. Nothing dramatic. Just rumors. A few days later, another person mentioned delayed payments from a company connected to my father. Then someone else brought up a stalled project. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it started painting a picture. Something wasn't right. One evening, I sat in my office looking through public business records. Old habits die hard. The more I looked, the more concerned I became. Several companies connected to my father's operations were carrying significant debt. Some properties had been leveraged heavily. A few investments clearly hadn't worked out. I closed the files and stared out the window. For most of my life, Victor Holloway had presented himself as the smartest businessman in the room, the man who always had a plan, the man who had chosen Colton as his successor. Now I couldn't stop wondering whether those decisions had finally caught up with them. A few days later, Colton called again. This time his voice sounded different, less confident, less polished. We exchanged a few minutes of small talk before I finally interrupted him. Just say it. Say what? The reason you're calling. Silence. Real silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind that happens when someone runs out of places to hide. I waited. For the first time during any of these conversations, Colton didn't try changing the subject. When he finally spoke, his voice was noticeably quieter. The family's having some financial problems. I closed my eyes. There it was. Finally. The truth. Then he added something I hadn't expected. We were hoping you might be willing to help. We were hoping you might be willing to help. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because after 19 years, that was apparently the first thing my family wanted from me. Not reconciliation, not an apology. Help. Financial help. I took a slow breath. How bad is it? Colton hesitated. That hesitation told me plenty. Bad. How bad, Colton? We've lost a lot. We. Interesting choice of word. The family that had spent 2 decades treating me like an outsider was suddenly using me again. I listened while he explained part of the situation. Not all of it. Just enough. Several investments had failed. Projects were stalled. Debt was piling up. The businesses Dad had spent years supporting weren't performing the way he'd expected. When he finished, I waited. Then I said the only honest thing I could. I'm not getting involved. Silence. I thought you might say that. Then why ask? Another pause. Because we're family. The words hit a nerve. For a second, I was 18 again, standing in my father's house being told my choices had disqualified me from being part of the family. I pushed the memory away. Family wasn't very important to any of you back then. Colton didn't argue, which somehow made it worse. The conversation ended shortly afterward. I wasn't angry when I hung up. Just tired. Tired of old wounds being reopened because someone suddenly needed something. That evening, I told Luke everything. He listened quietly. When I finished, he nodded. You did the right thing. I know. But knowing didn't automatically make me feel good. Part of me still hated conflict, even when it was necessary. The situation became stranger a few weeks later. Sophie came home from school and casually mentioned meeting an older woman downtown. At first, I didn't think much of it. Willow Creek wasn't a large town. People knew each other. Then Sophie added something else. She said her name was Elaine. I froze. Elaine Holloway? Sophie nodded. Yeah. Do you know her? I set down the dish I was holding, very carefully. She's your grandmother. Sophie's eyes widened. My grandmother. I immediately regretted how abruptly the conversation was happening. For years, Luke and I had answered Sophie's questions honestly without dragging her into old family conflicts. Now the conflict was finding her, not the other way around. According to Sophie, the encounter had been brief, polite, awkward, nothing dramatic. Still, it bothered me. A lot. A few days later, it happened again. This time, Elaine approached Sophie after a school event. Not aggressively, not in a threatening way. Just intentionally. When I learned about it, I called her. The conversation was uncomfortable from the first second. I just wanted to see her. Elaine sounded nervous. Then you should have called me. I didn't think you'd answer. I couldn't even argue with that. Because she was probably right. The hardest part was realizing Elaine didn't sound like Dad. Not even close. Victor always sounded certain. Defensive. Proud. Elaine sounded sad. Like someone carrying something heavy for a very long time. That didn't erase the past, but it complicated it. One afternoon, she left a voicemail. Nothing manipulative, nothing dramatic. Just a request to talk. I never responded. Not because I wanted revenge, because I genuinely didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, Sophie was becoming increasingly curious. At first, her questions were simple. What was Grandpa like? Why don't we see them? Did they live here the whole time? Questions I could answer. Then the questions became harder. One evening, she sat beside me on the porch while we watched the sun disappear behind the buildings downtown. Many of those buildings had once been empty. Now they were full of life. For a few minutes, we simply sat there quietly. Then Sophie spoke. Mom? Yeah? Can I ask something? I smiled. You usually do. She looked down at her hands, suddenly nervous. That nervousness worried me immediately. When she finally looked back up, her voice was soft. But the question hit harder than anything Colton had said. Did Grandpa really hate you? And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure how to answer. Writing end. Did Grandpa really hate you? Sophie's question stayed in the air for a few seconds. I looked at her, trying to find the right words, the honest words, because she deserved those. Finally, I shook my head. No. She frowned. But you never see him. I know. Then why? I took a slow breath. Your grandfather loved having control more than he loved being disagreed with. Sophie's expression told me she was still processing that. So he was angry? Very. She nodded slowly. Kids have a way of understanding complicated things when you stop trying to over-explain them. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder. I'm glad you didn't quit. That caught me off guard. Quit what? Your life. I laughed softly. Only Sophie could phrase something that way. But I understood what she meant. And honestly, that conversation changed something. Not dramatically, just enough. For years, I'd been carrying the story of what happened between me and my family. Now I was seeing it through my daughter's eyes. Not as a business dispute, not as a family feud. Just a series of choices people made. Some good, some terrible. A few months later, my attention shifted almost entirely to the biggest project of my career, an abandoned building near the center of Willow Creek. For decades, it had been a gathering place. Then it sat empty, year after year. Most investors ignored it. The renovation was complicated, expensive, and full of surprises, which probably explains why I wanted it. The goal wasn't another office building or another retail space. The plan was a community center, a place for local events, youth programs, classes, and neighborhood gatherings. Something that would belong to everyone. The project quickly became personal. Every time construction hit a setback, I pushed harder. Every time costs increased, I found another solution. Even Luke noticed. You talk about this building like it's another child. It is much less expensive than raising Sophie. That's definitely not true. I laughed. He wasn't wrong. The closer we got to completion, the more attention the project received. Local newspapers covered it. Business owners supported it. Community groups started planning future events. People kept thanking me. That still felt strange. For most of my life, I had been trying to prove I wasn't a disappointment. Now people were thanking me for helping improve their town. The contrast wasn't lost on me. As preparations for the grand opening began, something unexpected happened. Several people encouraged me to tell my story publicly, not the success story, the real story. What happened with my family, what my father had done, how I had been pushed out. One local business owner said it directly. You should set the record straight. Others agreed. Apparently, plenty of people had heard rumors over the years. Not everyone knew the truth. At first, I dismissed the idea. Then, one evening, I sat alone in my office and started writing. I told myself it was just for me, nothing more. But the words kept coming. Page after page. Every memory. The ultimatum, the wedding, the silence, the years of rebuilding. Everything. By midnight, I had written a letter that contained more truth than I'd spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades. I read it twice, then a third time. Parts of it made me angry. Parts made me sad. Some sections surprised me. I realized there were still wounds I hadn't fully acknowledged. The strange thing was that after writing it, I felt lighter, not heavier. A few days before the opening, Ruth stopped by my office. She noticed the pages immediately. What's that? The speech I might never give. She read part of it, then set it down carefully. Do you want revenge? No. The answer came faster than I expected. Ruth nodded. Good. That was all she said. But it stayed with me. Did I want people to know the truth? Absolutely. Did I want revenge? I wasn't so sure anymore. The night before the grand opening, I walked through the completed community center alone. The building looked beautiful. Families would use it. Students would use it. People would create memories here long after I was gone. That mattered more than any argument, more than any old wound. Back near the stage, the podium was already in place for the next morning. I set my speech on top of it. Then I placed the letter beside it. The letter that contained everything, every truth, every grievance, every unanswered question from the last 19 years. I stood there staring at both sets of pages. The building was completely silent. And when I finally turned off the lights and headed for the door, the letter was still sitting on the podium. I still hadn't decided whether anyone would ever hear it. The letter was still sitting on the podium when I arrived for the grand opening. I picked it up and looked at the first page. Every painful memory was there. The ultimatum, the wedding, the years of silence. For a moment, I considered reading it. Then I looked around the community center. Families were arriving. Volunteers were setting up tables. Kids were running through the hallways. This building wasn't about my past. It was about the town. I folded the letter and slipped it into my bag. A little later, I saw them. Victor, Elaine, Colton. 19 years of distance walking through the same door. Elaine looked nervous. Colton looked uncomfortable. Victor looked completely confident. The ceremony began, and somehow Victor ended up with a microphone. At first, he congratulated everyone involved. Then he said, Tessa's success reflects the values she learned from the Holloway family. A few people nodded politely. I felt my jaw tighten. Then another voice spoke. That's not how I remember it. Margaret Ellis stood from her seat. My former principal. The woman who had watched my entire journey. The room fell silent. Margaret calmly told the truth. She talked about seeing me leave town with almost nothing. Seeing me work multiple jobs. seeing me build a life without the support of the family that had rejected me. She didn't attack anyone. She simply told the truth. And that was enough. People began connecting pieces they had never understood before. Victor didn't argue. For once, he had no response. When it was my turn to speak, the letter stayed in my bag. I stepped up to the podium. "This building wasn't created by one person," I said. "It was built by people who kept showing up." I thanked volunteers, contractors, local businesses, friends, and neighbors. Then I looked at Luke, Ruth, and Sophie. The people who help you when there's nothing to gain are the people who change your life. That was all. No revenge, no public fight, just gratitude. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Elaine approached me carrying an old photo album. "I think this belongs to you." I opened it. School pictures, birthday parties, family vacations, photos I hadn't seen in almost 20 years. "You kept these?" She nodded. "I couldn't throw them away." Then she quietly said, "I'm sorry." Not an excuse, not a defense, just an apology. It didn't fix everything, but it felt genuine. I thanked her. Colton stood nearby but said very little. Victor left without speaking to me again. Strangely, I was okay with that. Not every relationship gets repaired. Sometimes clarity is enough. That evening, I sat at home looking through the album. Luke sat beside me. Sophie laughed at one of my childhood haircuts. "Mom, that's terrible." "It was fashionable." "No, it wasn't." I laughed. Then I turned another page, and suddenly, something became clear. For years, part of me had still been trying to prove my worth. To my father, to my family, to people who had already made up their minds. The truth was, they hadn't been deciding my value for a long time. I had been giving them that power myself. I closed the album. Outside, Willow Creek carried on like it always did. The community center would open again tomorrow. People would gather there. Life would continue. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. If this story connected with you, remember that sometimes the strongest victory isn't proving people wrong. It's realizing your worth never depended on their approval. If you've experienced something similar, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Van's Rock Stories. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.